John chapter 21, verse 20, I think we're up to. Does that sound right? Peter looked around and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following.
Yeah. Yep. That's it.
The one who at supper had leaned back close to him and asked the question, Lord, who is it that will betray you? When he caught sight of him, Peter asked, Lord, what will happen to him? Jesus said, if it should be my will that he wait until I come, what is it to you? Follow me. That saying of Jesus became current in the brotherhood and was taken to mean that disciple would not die. But in fact, Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, if it should be my will that he wait until I come, what is it to you? It is this same disciple who attests that what has here been written. It is this same disciple who attests what has here been written. It is in fact he who wrote it, and we know that his testimony is true. There is much else that Jesus did. If it were all to be recorded in detail, I suppose the whole world would not hold the books that would be written.
Which is probably a bit of hyperbole. Well, maybe not. If you take it that he, like it says, was the Word became flesh, and the Word was the agent of creation. Through him all things came to be. And you try to fathom the depth of what that means, that a man was actually living here for, even if it was only for 30 odd years, the backstory for that man, if he really was the infinite existing Son of God called the Word, who expressed God by becoming a human being, it would take the universe to fill the attempt to define what that really means. So, maybe it's not a hyperbole. Although it probably was for the bloke who wrote that in the first place.
So what do we make of, I suppose this is the end, isn't it, in a way? I was just wondering about whether we've come full circle or not. We think about the start. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. What's our connection at the end here of this gospel to what we talked about at the start?
It's a little bit of an enigma, really, because the end is at the end of chapter 20, and chapter 21 seems to be kind of an add-on.
The second end.
And I mean, the end in chapter 20 it's perfect, that you might believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah and that he is the Son of God, and that by trusting in him you might have eternal life. And that sounds like a very, very good conclusion. And it does go kind of, John starts off with this Word becoming flesh, and he has no doubt in his mind, and he doesn't want us to have any doubt in our minds at all, that Jesus really did have this connection with eternity, and that it was a huge, a wonder, a marvel. The Creator God would become part of his creation. It does two things, really. It talks about the kind of God who created, the kind of being or kind of character that God is, that he would be humble enough to do that. It also speaks about us, that we're the kind of creatures, and we know that we're so different. We're so similar, but we're so different from other animals, because we've got this fantastic ability to think, reflect, communicate, understand more than, possibilities to understand. I don't know whether there must be a limit. There's a poem by Rilke that says, if only everything would quieten down, then, he says, I would think you to where thinking ends, and possess you, even if for just the glimmer of a smile. I think there is a limit to our thinking, but I think it does come full circle, that we have this account, 20 chapters of what Jesus did when he was here on earth, all the time, just so obviously trying to communicate to his contemporaries and especially to his disciples who he really was. And I think John, in conclusion, in chapter 20, is saying, well, I've done the best I can. There's a whole lot more I could write. I know a lot more than what I've put down here, but this is enough. This should be enough to convince you that we've been visited by God, and respond to that visitation and join the bigger world that is hinted, well, not hinted at, revealed by the Word becoming flesh and living here. I meant to read through John's Gospel once more this last week, but I got too busy. And but I have been trying to think of all the things that John recorded, and if we didn't have chapter 21, we'd have a complete account of the earthly life of Jesus. And I'm more and more convinced that this last chapter has been added so that we've got an example of relating to Jesus after the resurrection. And I was just thinking about this yesterday and today. By the time you get to the end of chapter 21, you're reading it as though Jesus had not been crucified and buried and risen from the dead. It seems like it's the same old Jesus that was there before his arrest and killing. And I thought, well, that's strange that in my own thinking, I had come, even though the chapter starts very, very strangely. They're off fishing and involved in ordinary life. And then it looks like an ordinary person on the shore, maybe wanting to buy the fish they've caught. And then it looks like, no, this isn't an ordinary person. This is Jesus. But even then they were frightened to talk to him and held back and awkward. But it seems through the meal, as they had breakfast together with the fish and bread on the beach, they must have calmed down and got used to Jesus being there, and maybe the disciples, the 7 of them, kind of relaxed and were relating to Jesus. Doesn't say that Jesus actually ate with them, but Luke tells us that on the first occasion when he turned up to the group after his resurrection, he ate a piece of fish to to convince them that it was him. So, but we don't really know, I suppose, although my feeling is that it just sort of gradually eased up all the strangeness of him being alive and amongst them again, and they came back to just their habit of relating to him previously. And
so whether then we're left here at the end. How do we make sense of this last little bit? We've talked a bit about Peter looking around and seeing John, and Peter asked what will happen to him. Jesus says, if it should be my will that he wait until I come, what is it to you? What do we make of all that in the light of that? They're getting used to being around Jesus. He's resurrected. They're becoming more comfortable. Jesus has that big, long conversation with Peter about sort of restoring him and challenging him. And then this bit about John, it kind of seems odd.
Well, it seems to me there's good reason to think that John added that in because he was just uncomfortable with people saying that he was going to live until the Lord came back, when that wasn't exactly what Jesus had said. And so he tells this detail, excuse me, just so that he can scotch the rumor, as it were. And yeah, that must have been a strong motive in his mind when he began to tell this, add this chapter 21 at the end of the gospel.
I mean, there is in the early church, you read Paul's writings, we were reading Philippians yesterday. There is a strong sense in all of Paul's writings that Jesus' return is coming soon.
Yeah.
That the early church expected Jesus to come back.
Yeah. So there was no doubt whatsoever that was what he said he would do. And by this time, they were convinced he was going to do what he says. So, yeah. But at the same time, I think it really, there are a few things to say. The essence of it, that Peter turning around and saying, okay, well, I accept I'm going to end up badly when I get to be old. So he's had his kind of faith, the renewal of his faith confirmed, and the renewal of God's his purpose, of God's purpose for him. He's been told that he's got a job to feed the lambs, tend the sheep, feed the sheep, and
follow me.
And yeah, follow me is the main thing, really.
Yeah. And then also your suggestion last week that Jesus somehow, Peter wanted to give his life in following Jesus, but he wasn't able to do it leading up to the crucifixion. But he's now kind of allowing him to do that somehow.
Yeah. And it ties into, when Jesus said he was going away, Peter said, where are you going? And Jesus replied to Peter, where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but one day you will. And it's uncanny. But it doesn't say that he's going to be crucified, but stretching out your arms does sound a little bit like crucifixion. And very certainly the early writings from outside of the New Testament, from the early Christians, they're quite sure. Well, it wasn't straight away. It wasn't until Tertullian, and I think he was over 100 years later. But anyway, he was the first one who mentioned that Peter was to be crucified. But yeah, so the follow me, it sounds like it's going to be quite literal in Peter's case. But I imagine Peter is that Peter and John were good mates, and it's only natural that he would be curious. Okay, so what about me mate John? What's going to happen to him? And what Jesus said then is saying, well, none of your business, Peter. I've given you your commission. You get on with it. Follow me. And yeah. And it's almost like Jesus is saying, I am the shepherd. I am my disciples is I just need to know what I want from you, Peter, and I've told you. So you get on with that and leave John to me. And I think he's saying the same thing. It's the same, like, I shouldn't be curious how the Lord is going to use you. I expect, well, obviously he's using you tremendously, but it's not my business to kind of fulfill the details or know the details of your life, nor you me. I'm not sure how that works when you've got a movement that you're a leader of, because our job is to kind of make a strategy and work out tactics and deploy people here, there, and everywhere else. I suppose that's I just don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about, really. But I do feel like each one of us has our own direct connection to Jesus, who is still alive, and he's still concerned for each one of us, and he wants to maximize the possibilities of our life for his glory and for the purposes of the kingdom, but also because he wants to have the best for you. He knows what your capabilities are and your limitations are, and he wants to fulfill the possibilities that are there for you in the kingdom. My thinking.
And sometimes that means going through difficulties.
Well, that should be a given, you know. The man who wants to save his life has lost it already. It's only if you're prepared to give your life for my sake and the gospel, as Mark says, that you're going to be safe in the kingdom. Yeah, it's a challenge to follow Christ, but it's a bigger challenge not to follow him. We have our difficulties now and our reward later. If you set out to get your reward now, you're going to have big difficulties later.
So that wraps up our looking at John for the last couple of years. What do we make of the whole experience? Sorry, you go.
Yeah, I was just thinking, when it says in verse 23, that saying of Jesus became current in the brotherhood and was taken to mean that that disciple would not die. But in fact, Jesus didn't say that he wouldn't die. He only said, and then he quotes exactly what Jesus did say. And I thought that points out two things. First of all, that the Christians, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, were very, very interested in all that Jesus said, and they were talking about what Jesus had said. They had the scriptures of the Old Testament, but they didn't have the New Testament. Nothing was written. But this underlines the oral transmission of all that Jesus taught, that it was, and in that oral transmission, it was, like John says here, what was really crucial was what Jesus really said, not what he might have said or any kind of speculation about what he said. It was what Jesus really said that counted. I think that really needs to be taken into account when we read the critics of the New Testament, who like to come up with all kinds of ideas about how, things were changed and that people thought back from what was done at the end of the first century and put the good things into the mouth of Jesus, as though Jesus had said things that his followers, who were leaders and great men, had said after him. But I think this really puts the light of that way of thinking. I think from the very beginning, as it's shown here, what they were really concerned about was what Jesus really did say. And that's borne out in the last two verses, obviously written by somebody else. John had been identified as the back in verse 20, when Peter saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following, the one who at supper had leaned back close to him and asked the question, Lord, who will betray you? In verse 24, it's this same disciple, that is the disciple whom Jesus loved, who actually wrote the gospel. So it was not written by the elder John, who was a disciple of John, but it was actually written by John, who was the apostle who was there at the Last Supper, who called himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. It's just a final kind of statement by whoever was John's secretary, or somehow or other the publisher or the editor of whatever was being published. But it's very clearly an important thing to them to affirm that the gospel is actually written by an apostle who was there. And what we've got is eyewitness record of what Jesus did and what Jesus said. And then verse 25, like in verse 24, it says, we know that his testimony is true. So it looks like there's a group of people there. In the last verse, where it says, if we tried to record everything in detail, I suppose the whole world wouldn't hold the books that would be written. That as another person right at the end, who, for some reason or other, maybe he was thinking adding 21 to chapter 20, where the kind of summing up at the end of chapter 20 had said that there was much else that Jesus did that isn't recorded in this book. So he maybe sort of just added this little comment at the end to reflect back to what had been said at the end of chapter 20. Just, I don't know, just sort of feels like it's balanced there somehow or other.
So that brings us to the end.
Yeah.
How do we sum it all up?
I don't know. The way it ends with these two comments, first of all, a kind of group comment, and then an individual comment, that it seems like they're staggered to say anything profound enough to suit the gospel that they were handling. They only just had to, say, well, we know it's true because we know the bloke who wrote it and he was there. And then this odd comment at the end that by hyperbole kind of passes on the idea that there's more to Jesus than what we know. That it's a bigger thing than we even could guess from reading the gospel. It's not that they're not significant, but they're not the kind of memorable statements that the rest of the gospel is full of. I feel that way. I feel, as I read chapter 21, I've seen how awkward it is to relate to somebody who you've seen killed, reflected in the experience of those 7 disciples. And then I've seen how they've kind of the way of relating to Jesus that they had before. And Jesus is always saying things that take, like, where he says, about John, if it should be my will that he wait until I come, what is it to you? Like, obviously it could be misunderstood, and people did. And John's trying to clarify, no, you got it wrong. That's not what it means. And that's just a reflection, I think, of what's going on even to today. People still trying to work out what was really meant by the things that Jesus said, and the others, the writings, the letters, and, well, particularly the book of Revelation at the end. So I've wondered why, when John wrote that Peter looked round, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following, the one who at supper had leaned back close to him to ask the question, "Lord, who is it that will betray you?" Well, that's back in John chapter 13 at the Last Supper. And it says that Jesus was really distressed at the thought when he told everybody that one of them was going to betray him. And Peter had asked John, ask him, because John was next to Jesus around the table, and John did. Obviously, it's very strong in John's mind. It becomes almost a part of his identity that he was the one who got Jesus to give the signal, the sop that he handed to Judas Iscariot, and got him identified. And it says that as a result of that, Satan entered into him. So there's a kind of, I don't know, I can't make head or tail of it, really. And then the one before that is where Jesus tells Peter to feed his sheep, feed his lambs, tend his sheep, feed his sheep. And that obviously reflects chapter 10, where Jesus claims to be the shepherd and so on. They're all the way through. It's what am I trying to say there? Just the reality of what is recorded, the life of Jesus has had this impact that was helping the disciples to identify Jesus, but to identify themselves and their role in following Jesus. Maybe there's a suggestion there that we also need to get over being so awkward about relating to this man who rose from the dead, and settle our hearts and just make it a normal thing for ourselves to be following him like he told Peter to do.
Yeah, I mean, that is a struggle for us. It takes a lot of time and growth and effort to get to the point where you feel comfortable really connecting with an unseen Jesus. And you've got to learn to interact with the word and delve into the story so that you really understand it. And then as you do that, you grapple with the things that he said and the person he was, and you believe it. But to actually pray and connect with God, it's awkward at the start.
It is.
It takes time to learn to listen and be still and know what the Spirit is saying in your inner being, that confirmation that he really loves you, and all those things.
And there's no doubt this is what God wants. I mean, Jesus turned up on the beach to intersect the life of these 7 disciples, and he's done the same for each one of us. And it's really, we need to make the effort to get over the awkwardness of it and make it just a normal part of life, I think.
What's helped for you in that?
I think memorizing scripture, memorizing it and meditating on it. That's and I think personalizing it. I go back to Ephesians chapter 1 every second day. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has bestowed upon us every spiritual blessing in the heavenly realms. Just think about that. Every spiritual blessing in the heavenly realms. We're already united to Christ. A little later on in Ephesians, it says how that we are seated in union with Christ. We're seated with him in the heavenlies. There's enough there to spend 2 hours thinking and praying and forcing your mind to accept the reality that is true of you, true of me, true of every true believer right at this very moment. And I think that's the kind of effort that it requires to make it true for yourself in the depth of your own being. And when you do, you find that there's a confirmation that just comes in joy, and gratitude, I think, that sometimes just takes over your emotions, and you can't help but feel the love of God and the depth of gratitude that we owe to him for what he's done for us. Yeah.
It's great. I like it. Yep. Get it to memory. Get it sifting around in our heads, round and round and round, and grappling with those ideas. And then those ideas become not just ideas from the story or God's ideas, they start to become our ideas, and a pathway to relating in a genuine way with the actual story and with the author of the story ourselves.
Yep. Exactly that.
All right, well, that's probably a good place to finish.
Okie doke. What's next?
I don't know. Shall we spend a session just reflecting on the whole of John?
Yeah, I want to do that. For myself, I want to read through John and just try to read it in one stretch and let the impact of it be felt.
Okay, well, let's do that next week. We'll have 35 minutes to reflect on the whole of John.
All right. That's good.
Great.
Yep.
Thanks, Laurie.
Hope you're not late for your meeting.
See you soon.
Yeah. See ya.